So welcome back to as close to in-person as we have for our Advent Monday School. I know we missed a little bit last week, but I do hope you all watched and enjoyed the YouTube video, which we will sort of touch on a little bit this week and as we keep going through the season. But first, were there questions, things that stood out to folks from that YouTube video, things people perhaps want to know more about or comment about before we get started?
Yeah. Hi, Pastor Jay. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Hello?
Yes. What's up?
Oh, okay. Okay. It was wonderful. I thought it was really great. The one thing that surprised me, I had never heard of the fragment, the manuscript fragment at Oxford that was like, what, hundreds and hundreds of, very much older than anything, I guess from ancient Greece or something. And the thing that really surprised me was the music that they figured out from it sounded sort of similar to, not exactly the same, but sort of. I thought it would be quite different from anything that we would be familiar with because it was so many hundreds of years older. But it didn't seem to be. I was a little surprised about that.
Well, part of that is your yes, is obviously our current music has roots somewhere, so there's part of that, but there's also the side of the people singing it and the people trying to figure out what it sounded like.
Right.
Are people that know what a Western scale sounds like.
Yeah.
It's why it's difficult for Western singers to sing some of the tones of Eastern music because we don't have it in our throats to sing the same kind of tones.
Yeah.
So whether or not it actually sounded like that, or if that was as close as we could get, well, I think that's something.
Yeah, I
for
know.
you just to know.
Yeah. But then they said, it all disappeared, for centuries, and then they started back up again, in the Middle Ages. So anyway, but the whole thing was just wonderful. I really loved it.
Good. I'm glad.
Oh, and I want to mention too, Brother Heinrich. You talked about him and so forth, and that was very interesting. I didn't know I didn't know all the stuff about. He was into what's the whatever the term is, self-harm or whatever, in order to get visions and things. That's pretty awful. But do you know there's a little children's store or thing for children of all ages, a little thing with the conductor Brian Kay called Brother Heinrich's Christmas. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
I'll share it with you sometime. I have a recording of it.
Oh, good.
It's a fun thing. It's a nice little holiday story about Brother Heinrich writing In Dulce Jubilo.
Good.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely a great one. So yes.
Oh yeah. So anyway, that's it for me for now.
Good. Were there others who had thoughts? Yes, Martha.
This is Martha. I was surprised that centuries ago, when England went, Catholicism in England gave way to Protestant, that there was concern that singing and choral part in the service would suffer, because I didn't realize there was that much music in Catholic liturgy and in services at that point.
Well, I mean, so part of it is, the church has always been the bastion of the humanities and music and things like that. So certainly for a long time, it was the place where people knew and learned things like music and the texts that were there. But I think part of it too is whether or not it would be lost entirely or lost in the style and quality that they knew. There's another fabulous documentary about sort of the arguments around the time of Elizabeth I, and whether or not to keep the same kind of music or not. But yeah, it's very interesting to hear how some of these transitions that we, for from a Lutheran perspective of Reformation, are really proud of the new music that we had, and how much more of it was put in the hands of the masses. To hear in other places that it sort of didn't play out quite the same.
I was also surprised that there was not really much mention at all of Bach and the Christmas oratorio and the choral, his chorale works.
Well, this was put on by the BBC. We spent a lot of time on Handel and English,
Right.
and English music, which I think really, when you start to think about some of the more, shall we say, sentimental music that we have, it's certainly, a lot of it filters through, even for us in America, filters through sort of the lens of England, and sort of what that is. I think often, we all think of sort of the sort of Dickensian Christmas. But yeah, but it is very interesting. Bach got very little mention, and sort of just a little bit there at the end.
Right.
Yeah. Were there others?
Yeah, if I could chime in, I thought that was fabulous. And I learned a lot, like everyone said. I know he couldn't do everything, but I was surprised at all the composers that were left out. And obviously it was in an hour or whatever. But, and like Martha, I too was surprised. We don't nowadays associate the Catholic Church with being so prolific, just having a lot of music. So that was interesting. I thought it was very interesting and informative, and I thought the music was just glorious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think that's the thing. We often, we think of folks like, certainly from a Lutheran perspective, we think of like Bach, right, as sort of this church composer for the Reformation. We think of the hymn writers. We'll talk about a couple coming up. We think about those and sort of forget how much was written for, sponsored by, the church, which pre-Reformation was Catholic, period. I mean, there just was no other option. But yeah, but I think it is very interesting for us to hear sort of what those transitions were like.
I think too that what they were talking a lot about was choral music and performance music as compared to congregational singing and carol singing and that sort of thing. So they obviously had a bias toward the choral and performance music, which is wonderful too. But that's why, in my opinion, there was a lot that was left out. So yeah.
Well, and I get the sense. So I'll be honest. I sort of lucked upon this video that I thought was great. It's a series on the BBC, so you can listen to other things about history of music, and sacred music and choral music. This was sort of the Christmas special version, which I think also alters what is covered and what isn't as you discuss other things. But yeah, it definitely was sort of focused on choral sacred music and its history, which was interesting that it went back as far as sort of the time of origin with that first hymn, which had nothing to do with Christmas. And perhaps if we would have cut that little beginning part, we would have been able to fit in Bach somewhere in there. So
I
yes.
would also say that in regard to the Catholic Church having so much music before the having so much music in their worship, before the Reformation came along, but yet not mentioning carols. And back then, the congregations didn't really sing. It was all done by the priests and the choirs. And if I'm right, I think I'm right about that in general.
Yep.
That the congregations didn't do much of anything, and that was one of the changes that happened in the Reformation, where we emphasize congregational singing, because I know in the few when I'm in Catholic churches every once in a while, they don't sing hymns nearly as well or fervently as we do. They're just, you know, it's something about, you know, they don't I don't know what the reason is, but they, you know, the Catholic congregations don't, they even today don't seem to be enthusiastic or used to hymn singing a lot.
I mean,
Maybe.
I would now, yes. So I would agree with you on the history there, right? That we sort of see this, as music gets more complicated. So starting with sort of the single tones that we heard in that very first piece from the time of origin, as it gets more complicated and more parts, right? Polyphony, more parts are put in. That's when it's really taken out of the congregation's mouths and into choirs, because you needed to know how to read your part, because, you know, so long as we were all on the same tone, you could just listen to the person next to you and know that you were going to get it. And so it's taken out, it's then brought back still in harmony, sort of in the Reformation. I would argue that talking a little bit about music at the time of the Reformations, of which there were several, is not quite the same as mapping onto Catholicism today, because I would argue there are plenty of churches, even Lutheran churches today, that don't sing. We're blessed to be a part of a congregation that likes to sing, but there are plenty of congregations that allow the choirs and the cantors to be the ones to sing. It's not necessarily denominational inheritance, because there are plenty of other Catholic churches that are very boisterous about their singing. It just sort of depends on area and tradition and what's inherited in the culture. But yes, thank you, John. That is a good reminder of sort of the way we go
Sure.
from the mouth of the congregation to the choir and back to the congregation.
Yeah.
Pastor, can you address, I'm not sure I quite understood, maybe other people can chime in here. At one point, there was a woman who was talking about how it was purposeful that you couldn't understand the text. Did I?
No, it wasn't purposeful that you couldn't understand the text. The danger was, as music got more complicated, that you wouldn't be able to understand the text, and so you needed to be purposeful in the way it was layered so that
Okay.
you heard it. So that was the one where they did the three parts that enter at different points but all had the same words and the same melody, so it was more like a canon than it was really harmony, because that way if you couldn't catch the tenor singing it, you would catch the soprano singing it. And so yes, you got most of it in there. But it was a call to be intentional in the writing of music so that the music didn't overshadow the understanding of the words.
Because initially I thought the whole thing about the little people not being able to read the words, you know what I mean? I initially thought, well, maybe that was part of the, can't give them too much of the text or something. I don't know.
I mean, to be honest, it would have been in Latin, so you still would have had to know Latin, but that you could understand the words is yes.
Right. That makes a lot more sense. Thank you for clearing that up.
Catherine.
Well, and
wait a second. Catherine just unmuted herself.
I just wanted to add that when music moved in the medieval and Renaissance period, moved from like just monody, just like one melody going on at a time, to polyphony, like multiple lines of music, as in motets and that sort of thing. That was a real concern in the church, that because the way motets and polyphony was written, that you couldn't understand the words. And so there was a like a counter movement against it, I think, somewhere in there after polyphony had made its debut, that the church said, no, you can't use that.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Right. And indeed, it is more difficult to understand the words when there's polyphony.
Right.
Multiple voices going on sort of independently of each other. Anyway, it's an interesting issue, and that was a concern back then. And so, yeah.
Oh, I
Now,
was just going
John.
to say that before, and remember before the printing press, the congregations were largely illiterate. They didn't know how to read. They just listened. The
Arguably
priest
even
and
after the printing press, but yes.
no, before.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
no, but
Oh, right. Okay.
just having the
And
printing press didn't bring about literacy.
right. No, but and the people that knew, the clergy and the monks and all, were the ones that knew how to read and do manuscripts and stuff like that. And anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last thoughts on this before we move on to some Advent music. All right, so a little exploration of some Advent hymnody. So we're just going to talk about a couple of hymns that, we've had an opportunity now to talk, to hear from the video, to have some conversation now, and certainly for those that were part of our sort of early summer session of Monday School, we know the ways that music sort of gets to the heart of people. The heart of worship, heart of people. It just has a way of moving and driving home some ideas. And so I picked a couple of Advent carols that we have sung and or will be singing this season for us to point out a couple of things about them. So this hymn, Prepare the Royal Highway, is one that is, we're looking at the time of Bach a little after. It sort of has been around, it comes via Sweden, all these wonderful things we could say about it. But the interesting thing is, it's really in the way the church uses it, in the way the church's worship is structured in the 21st century, it's really a Palm Sunday hymn. So if we look at the words, prepare the royal highway, the King of Kings is near, let every hill and valley a level road appear. That is Advent. And greet the King of Glory, foretold in sacred story. Hosanna to the Lord, for he fulfills God's word. God's people see him coming, your own eternal King. Palm branches strew before him, spread garments, shout and sing. God's promise will not fail you, no more shall doubt assail you. Hosanna. This is the only, as far as I can tell, currently in our hymnal, is the only hymn with a refrain of Hosanna that doesn't fall during Holy Week. And one of the really interesting things about this is that this is, in talking about all of the history that we've been doing with Advent, this is a holdover text from the single year lectionary. So we talked about how there's now a 3-year lectionary. There used to be a 1-year lectionary on rotation. And in the 1-year lectionary, the first Sunday of Advent every year, first Sunday of Advent, was the Gospel of the Triumphal Entry. So we heard of Jesus coming in triumph with the Hosanna and the palms and the whatever, which had much the same intention as what we now have with always starting with a little bit of an apocalypse at the beginning of Advent, which is this idea of setting Advent as not just waiting for the baby in the manger, but of the Savior, the one who comes, sort of adult Jesus. And what it did is it sort of allowed for that anticipation. Palm Sunday is a great example of this anticipation of the one who is coming in the name of the Lord, right? We have all these texts. And so we get this particular hymn, which I love, and we've already done it twice. I do love this one, but the text has a couple of things that are very Advent-y, right? Let every hill and valley a level road appear. But then we get this thing about palm branches and spread garments, which is right out of Matthew's version, and that's the version from the 1-year lectionary, Matthew's version of the Triumphal Entry. And that's where we get this sort of setting then of this preparing the royal highway, not just for the baby, but for the one who comes, which is fitting that it would be the Palm Sunday story sort of in the beginning of this, of the Holy Week remembrances, the beginning of the salvation event, the Christ event, if you will, that is Holy Week itself. And so just an interesting thing as we look at the words here of Prepare the Royal Highway, it's a wonderful hymn, but it also can be done, and we did it this year, as a matter of fact, on Palm Sunday itself, because this text fits there as well, which was the intention of the original sort of first Sunday of Advent. So now we have a much more well-known, oh yes, Catherine.
I'm sorry. I would like to add, maybe you're going to say this in a minute, but one of our Advent hymns is, "Oh Lord, how shall I meet you?" And we sing it, "Oh Lord, how shall I meet you? How welcome you, all right," etc. In the book, in the old red book, in the service book and hymnal, oh, there it is, yeah. In the service book and hymnal, it was set to the tune of all that we now sing, "All glory, laud, and honor." So it was, oh, Lord, how shall I meet you? Oh, welcome you, all right. And I'm not, either tune, whatever, that's fine. But I think that use of the Palm Sunday tune, you can't sing that tune, the All Glory, Laud, and Honor tune, without thinking of Palm Sunday. And so the tune, that use of that tune, brought the whole idea of Palm Sunday into the first Sunday in Advent, or whenever, by the use of that tune. Anyway.
Absolutely. No, and I think, and so let's stay on this one, because these weren't in any particular order. So let's stay on this one for a minute. And so I lifted this one up as one of the sort of uniquely Lutheran contributions to Advent hymnody. So a lot of the Advent carols, by the way, so Advent carols, Advent hymns, sort of all, a carol, a hymn, a song, take your pick. But this one in particular, if you look at the dates at the very bottom there, you're looking at Paul Gerhardt, one of the great hymn writers, a good Lutheran, sort of from the early 1600s, sort of kind of just misses Luther, but is sort of in the first wave of Lutheranism, certainly writes some of the great hymns that we know. And so this really is one of those hymns that we contribute to the story, and one that, I'll be honest, I don't know that I've heard in any other denominational Advent that I've been a part of. Most of these other ones I have heard, in the Episcopal churches I've served, in Presbyterian churches, and Methodist churches. I've heard most of these other ones, maybe not the exact same texts, but very similar and same tunes. But what we have here is sort of this, and at least whether it's interesting to hear about the Palm Sunday tune, but also in this particular tune by Johann Kruger, where you end up with what really sounds like a good Lutheran contribution to Advent carols. We sang this, not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before. But again, this idea of the ways that we can see and hear more than just the stories of Advent. So, for example, this past Sunday we sang "On Jordan's Banks the Baptist Cry," right? On Jordan's Banks the Baptist Cry, announcing that the Lord is nigh. Awake and hearken, for he brings glad tidings of the King of Kings, which is basically just a song to celebrate that it's John the Baptist Sunday. And it's a beautiful hymn. I love using it. I frankly love Put Your Finger Anywhere in the Advent section, and I enjoy the song. But what that text has is different than this text, which really puts everything into perspective, right? This isn't just telling the story. This isn't just saying, oh, we're waiting for the baby. Oh, John the Baptist is here. Oh, this is really, this really puts everything into this great theological perspective of really what Advent's about. What are we waiting for? And why is both the waiting and the one for whom we wait so important? right? So we have this, I lay in fetters groaning, you came to set me free. So this is the already part. I stood my shame bemoaning, you came to honor me. A glorious crown you give me, a treasure safe on high that will not fail or leave me as earthly riches fly, right? This is this understanding of the Savior, the one we're waiting for. But also, what is this waiting about, right? Rejoice then, you sad hearted, who sit in deepest gloom, who mourn your joys departed and tremble at your doom. All hail the Lord's appearing, O glorious Son, now come. Send forth your beam so cheering and guide us safely home, right? So we have this already, but not yet, this fabulous sort of sitting and waiting with Lutheranism. Sort of, if you were to put Lutheranism into an Advent carol, this is largely what would come out of the computer on the other end. And that's what I think is so powerful about Advent texts and Advent hymns, but in particular, this one, is that it has that way of setting us in those places of the already but not yet. Martha, I muted your phone, just so you know, you're on mute. So yeah, so we have that wonderful sort of back and forth there. But thank you, Catherine. I had completely forgotten about the All Glory, Law, and Honor part. But again, we have that already, but not yet of Palm Sunday. You know, it's the joy of anything in the church. And I'm going to use some very specific Gordon Lathrop language here, is we're not play acting anything. Advent is not about pretending we don't know Jesus is going to be born. Christmas is not about pretending that we don't know Jesus is going to die. Holy Week isn't about knowing is pretending we don't know Jesus is going to rise again, right? Easter isn't about knowing that Jesus isn't going to leave us, right? All of these things aren't about pretending anything. We know and sit with the whole story, but we sort of enact it ourselves, physically, spiritually, with worship and with words. We sort of enact it as we go. And that's one of the beauties of so many of our Advent texts, but some of these more specifically, is that you're able to weave in Palm Sunday with Prepare the Royal Highway. You're able to weave in Holy Week texts and Holy Week allusions, even though it's Advent, because we know what's coming. With this one, we're able to put the coming, ourselves as waiting to greet Jesus, even though Jesus already come, right? I mean, the third line of the third line of the fourth verse, all hail the Lord's appearing, is something that has happened. Oh, glorious Son, now come, is something we're waiting for, right? And so just to sit here with this is not pretending anything. It's just saying, this is what this season is about. This is about what we're doing. And so it's really, it is no disrespect to any of the other hymns we have for Advent, and certainly there are some beautiful ones, but some, as with every season, but Advent has this ability to have some carols that really just retell a story, and others that really sort of situate us with the theology of the season. So this is one of my favorites. Just a second, we're going to go back. So comfort, comfort now, my people. Now this is one that comes to us by various people. All these ones, if you see, are sort of from this sort of 1600s, 1700s era. But this is one that has sort of this beautiful danceability, but that is uniquely, with the words, uniquely Advent and unique to certain years. So this past Sunday, we had the prophecy from Isaiah 40, right? Comfort, oh comfort now my people, saith our God, right? Which ends with, in the voice, in the wilderness, there's a voice crying, prepare the way of the Lord. It's paired in year B with Mark, John the Baptizer, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, from John the Baptizer. That pairing doesn't happen every year. We don't get comfort, oh comfort my people, saith our God, every year. We get it in year B. So that we have this comfort, comfort now my people, so says our God, comfort those who sit in darkness, mourning under sorrow's load, but pair it with For the herald's voice is crying in the desert far and near, calling us to true repentance since the reign of God is here. You're now pairing Isaiah with John the Baptist, which fits so uniquely into the text that we had just yesterday. Not that we don't sing this every year, but one of the things that when we talk about the ways that Advent music, I think in particular, but any music, has this way of sort of stirring the heart, is that if we sang this in a year where we don't get Isaiah's comfort, at all, we still would know what we're alluding to, and we still would pair that with John the Baptist, and we still would know that Isaiah is sort of foretelling John, who is foretelling Jesus, right? And so we'd be able to put all those together, but we don't need them every year because we have some of these great texts here. Talking about music that's reused, we also use this tune often. I pick it for the Easter Vigil for Signs and Wonders. So there's another hymn, a relatively recent hymn, a 21st century hymn, with text by Susan Powell Sherwin, who is a fabulous hymn writer out of Minneapolis. Her husband, David Sherwin, is the inheritor of Paul Mons's organ bench in Minneapolis. It's at Mount Olive. And she sets this same tune, bum, 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 not with so many half notes, so it dances a little bit more. But she sets the idea of Christmas and Easter and ourselves into these ways that signs and wonders are all around us, right? So that the first verse is about wings of angels greet the maiden, and God finds a dwelling here. Thus does glory shine at midnight, open hearts invite the starlight, right? This is a very Christmas verse. But the second verse is hope and freedom join the circle, Mary to the garden came, saw the radiance of the marvel, heard the risen call her name, right? This is an Easter text. And then we get cast aside all fear and hiding. Hand in hand we dance the round. God is with us, Christ abiding, and the Spirit's gifts abound. Called by God to holiness, let us boldly serve and bless, and to hearts that sigh and hunger, may our lives dance signs and wonders. And so with a title like Signs and Wonders, you would think it would fit last week when we had Signs and Wonders out of Mark. But then you get this Christmas verse and you think, yes, that's what it's about. And then you think, oh, well, wait, maybe it's about Easter because now it's about Mary in the garden. Oh, it's about us. And then you listen to the tune and you go, oh, but it's really a hymn about comfort, comfort, comfort now my people. And when you put all of these things together, you sort of get this happy overlap of everything that's going on, which whether or not you ever knew that, probably if you grew up or have been a part of a Lutheran congregation for even a couple of years, whether you sing one or the other, you will probably hearken to the other, depending on how things go, just because it is that familiar of a tune. And so just always something fun to think about when we think about texts. These are the three particular Advent carols we're going to talk about. I'm going to bump us into talking about the O antiphons, which is more music and poetry, but a slightly different style. So do folks have last thoughts on Prepare the Raw Highway, Comfort, Comfort Now My People, or O Lord, How Shall I Meet You? Seeing none. Veni Emmanuel, Come Emmanuel. This is one that we have been using at Christ Ascension to begin our worship every week. It is one that I think if we ever didn't sing it for an Advent at some point during Advent, there would be pretty valid complaints. This is for lots of people sort of the Advent carol. Now, it depends who you talk to. There's other people that would say there's plenty of other things that are necessary for the celebration of Advent. But this is one that has been a part of the church for at least 1400 years. So what we do know is that O Come, Emmanuel is a hymn from the 18th century based on the O antiphons, which are from the 6th century. And the only reason why we say the 6th century is because there's an author, a Christian apologist in the 6th century, who mentions the O antiphons, not all of them, but alludes to the O antiphons. So we know that they were at least in use and pretty widely by the 6th century, could be older. So we're talking about like 1400 years here that we've been dealing with using these O antiphons. The antiphons are part of the Latin Rite Vespers service. And there's one assigned for every day of the year. So there are 365 of them. This one is, but for the 7 days leading up to Christmas Eve. So that's the 17th of December through the 23rd of December. Those days you substitute in. So I should rephrase. There are not 365 antiphons, but there's a cycle of antiphons. And for these 7 days, you take out what's supposed to be there and you put in these ones. So that 365 days a year, there is something assigned. These 6 days are, or these 7 days are unique. And the antiphons themselves are O Sapientia, the O Wisdom, O Adonai, O Lord, O Radix Yesi, O Root of Jesse, O Clavis David, the Key of David, Oriens, which we have as day spring, but it's really more like sunrise. O Rex Gentium, the King of Nations, and Emmanuel. These are all titles of Jesus. These are all parts of prophecy from Isaiah about the Messiah who is coming. And so we put them all together as sort of these titles of the one for whom we are waiting. And so we get these sort of 7 of them, which in a minute we'll go through what the actual prophecies are. Interestingly enough, and this is sort of a later find by people, and so whether it was intentional or not, I don't know, but this is what we say now, is that the first letter of each, when you take Sapientia, Adonai, Radix Yesi, Clavis David, Oriens, Rex Gentium, and Emmanuel, form an acrostic. It's not surprising. There's plenty of evidence of this. We know that Psalm 119 is an acrostic psalm, meaning that each of the sections, each verse of each section starts with the same letter and goes through the alphabet, through the Hebrew alphabet. But sarkore means nothing, right? So if you take Sapientia, Adonai, Radix Yesi, Clavis David, Oriens, Rex Gentium, Emmanuel, and put them in order, you get sarkore. Doesn't mean anything. But backwards and split up, and you get arrow cross. Arrow cross is Latin for tomorrow I will be, or tomorrow I am, or tomorrow I come, or whatever. Cross is tomorrow and arrow is I. And between the two of them, you get tomorrow I. And you sort of put in a state of being because that's how Latin works, and you get to do that. And so when you look at how these line up, from the 17th, sort of for the last week of Advent, so the last 7 days of Advent, leading up to the 23rd of Advent, because that's the last day of Advent, or the 23rd of December, you're singing these, and together they have this message back to us. So we call out, "O come," and what we get back is, yes, tomorrow I come, and the next day is, conveniently enough, Christmas Eve. Now, as I said, whether that's actually the way it was intended or not, I think we can all leave that up to history to tell us the truth far, far further down the road. But for now, this is one of those pieces that we took the poetry of the early church. So that's the antiphons. So that would be around around the time of origin. So if you think about the way that that first piece was sung in the YouTube video, that style of music is how these would have been sung. And then in the 18th century, someone in France went, that's really beautiful, but let's put it to like real plain song and make it a little dancey. And look, we have a great hymn. Interestingly enough, the first translations and the first usages of this only included 5 verses. So we didn't have all 7, which calls into question whether or not the tradition of Arrow Cross and the all seven of them leading to this sort of acrostic message, if that was really sort of from the beginning. I sort of think that what would have happened is we would have ended up with that going hand in hand with the use of the antiphons. And so when we put it to music and congregational music and started using it around the 18th century, we would have used all 7 verses because that would have been what was important. But again, we sort of figure out what we have. So we have these 7 verses. And if you think back, we've already sung some of these, right? O come, O wisdom from on high, ordering all things far and nigh. And so that's what we have. But what's curious is these don't have the refrain we're used to, right? Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel, right? We don't have that refrain in these. What we have is this reason for why. And so, O wisdom coming forth from the mouth of God, reaching from one end to the other, mightily and sweetly ordering all things, come and teach us the way of prudence. And that's the end. That's the antiphon. There is no response. When you pair it with the tradition of Arrow Cross, then that's the rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel. But we have this for all of these, right? O Adonai, O Lord of might. This we know as Lord of might, and leader of the house of Israel. So this is, O come, O Lord of might, who to your tribes on Sinai's height in ancient times once gave the law in cloud and majesty and awe. Rejoice, rejoice. And so that's what we have here. And so we see for all of these, we have these same these sort of same usages, but without that refrain, which is really just sort of a fun way for us to think about this. Now, again, when we look to the use of the O antiphons, the tradition that we inherit is that they are for these last 7 days of Advent, sort of December 17th to the 23rd. It also fits nicely into a 7-week Advent. 7 is always a beautiful number. So we're able to sing all of these verses this year. We started with Emmanuel because that's the one that we know best, but arguably that's why we've been using those. So that's what I have about that, and I can answer more questions about that. You also can, frankly, Wikipedia this and get some great information. You can look this up in a lot of places about the O antiphons. There are congregations that still to this day have the antiphons service. So instead of doing it for 7 days, they do one service that focuses on the O antiphons. As a matter of fact, I think St. Mark's Cathedral in Seattle does an antiphons service. But I wanted to leave us with this because this is sort of, for us, one of the sort of pinnacle songs that we kind of have to sing for Advent. And so I wanted to be sure that we touched on that. Thoughts, questions, concerns, ideas, wonder?
I wonder something. I wonder if there's a connection between antiphon and antiphonal. Were the O antiphons recited alternately by 2 groups, antiphonally, or is?
Oh, yeah. So if anybody else, so you are correct in the connection between antiphon and antiphonal, in that they are all about this sort of 2-sided singing, right? So somebody sings something and somebody sings something back. If somebody else remembers their history better than I do on antiphons and antiphonal, but actually specifically monastic antiphons, please, by all means, step in. But you aren't wrong there, Tom, in that connection.
But I know about, they were, these antiphons were sung before the Magnificat on those given days. And it just like we have antiphons before the psalm, you know, when we sing psalms, and we call them antiphons sometimes or refrains sometimes. I don't know though if there was a back and forth issue
Yeah.
as far as antiphonal singing back and forth with the, you know, the choir and the people, or two different groups of choir or whatever. That I don't know.
Yeah. I was going to say, Tom, you know, often when we think about antiphonally as an adjective, we think of sort of this half of the congregation sings and then this half of the congregation sings, right? So you sing and you get echoed, which is different than responsive singing, which is a single person singing and everyone singing back. That being said, when we talk about the actual pieces of the liturgy, of which the antiphon is one, as Catherine pointed out, it's an antiphon in this case is more of a refrain or an intro. We often call the repeated part of the psalm when we have a choir the refrain. Technically, that's the antiphon. It's the refrain. And arguably, when you talk about sort of monastic or even congregational singing without a book in front of you, the antiphon is that thing that the congregation can sing while a single person or a choir sings the verses. So yeah, but specifically whether or not how all of those pieces work together, that's, I'm going to need to do a little more research on that one. But you're not wrong in that all of these are about the style of singing. Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Others? Well, seeing none, I do want us to turn for a moment. And I just realized I didn't send out the reading for this week. I was busy sending out the link to the video. Well, that's all right. Allow me to read to you the gospel from yesterday, which is what we've been focusing on in our Bible studies during Advent. So this is Mark 1:1. This is the very beginning of Mark. I just wanted to sort of talk about sort of some of the history we have here. So if you want to take some notes, or this video will be up. And I apologize, next week I will include the reading itself. I also realized Elizabeth pointed out to me that I sent out the devotional that has all the right readings and all the wrong dates. So it was a bit of a rocky start getting back into all of these announcements. So from Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. He proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." So there's a couple of things I want to point out about Mark, just since we have started the year of Mark. The first is Mark wastes no time. So I've said this before, Mark is the shortest gospel, and it's short for a reason. In Mark's mindset and among Mark's cohort of people, there's no time to waste. Jesus is coming back, and he's coming back tomorrow, and you got to get ready. And you have to have as many people as possible ready with you. So you got to get the word out. So it's a short gospel. It's 16 verses. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it takes about 45 minutes to recite. So it's not that long. But but he wastes no time. There is no prologue. There's no "in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," in this beautiful cosmology that comes out of John. There's no genealogy. We don't care where Jesus comes from. So it's not like Matthew, where Abraham begat Isaac, begat Jacob, begat so-and-so, begat yada yada. And eventually we get to the fact that Mary and Joseph, that via Mary, Jesus is begotten. We don't waste any time with the genealogy. We don't care. We don't put Jesus into history and say in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered, and in those it was the first taxation put out during the reign of Caesar Augustus, in the reign of Quirinius as governor of Syria, right? We don't care about the history. We don't care about the birth. We don't care about the growing up part. There is nothing about Jesus before he shows up for the baptism, which arguably the church has put around the age of 30. So there's nothing about Jesus before 30. And Mark's gospel starts with, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus. The end. Like this is just what it's about. And he puts it in perspective by using some of the language from the very end of the gospel, which is, this is the gospel of Jesus, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The Son of God is important here because that is the very phrase that the centurion will say at the foot of the cross. So we are tying the beginning to the end. 16 chapters apart, but we're not wasting any time to get there. If you get nothing else, you're going to get that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. The second thing that's interesting about about Mark, is that Mark is the only one who makes John an active baptizer. So as you read Mark, Mark talks about John the Baptizer, who is the same person as John the Baptist, but everybody else sort of gives him a title. And what Mark does is he says what John is doing. So if you look to, for example, if you look to Matthew, Matthew has, in those days, capital J John, the capital B Baptist. John the Baptist. It's his name and it's his title. Mark says capital J John, who is the one who is baptizing. Doesn't care about titles, but makes this an active thing, right? Nobody's just sitting around with any use for titles. Everybody's active as they're doing. Because again, there's this urgency to Mark. And the last thing, and this is purely semantics, but Mark places the voice in the wilderness and not the path in the wilderness. So the thing for us to remember about, and I apologize, I know this would be easier with the text in front of you. I will send out a little note with the text attached to it. But Isaiah says, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. What Mark says is, as is written in the prophet Isaiah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, comma, quotes, prepare the way of the Lord. So there's a difference between the road and the path being in the wilderness and the one who is proclaiming, the voice itself, being in the wilderness. Why is that important? Because again, the asceticism necessary for John means that he has to be in the wilderness. John has to be in the wilderness because he's all about this preparing for the one who is coming tomorrow. And that's the same urgency that Mark is trying to get across to his people, which is to say that it is not, there's really no point, right? Mark falls very much into the Pauline school of, don't get distracted with anything going on around you because we're busy waiting for Jesus. He's coming back tomorrow, right? Paul goes so far as to say, don't bother getting married because it's kind of a waste of time because Jesus is coming back tomorrow. That's a little bit what's going on here with John, which is John's in the wilderness getting ready without the distractions of what's going on around him. And the only reason why it matters that the voice is in the wilderness and not the path is in the wilderness is because it has some implications for which direction the path is going. If the path is in the wilderness and needs to be straightened out, then the path is coming towards civilization. You want to make it easier for someone to get through the wilderness to civilization. If the voice is in the wilderness, it doesn't matter where the path is. Every path needs to be taken. Every path needs to be taken into consideration and straightened out and made easier and more level. And so that's a slight difference there. A lot of information there without the text in front of you, but all of those in those 8 verses, we get a lot with a big impact that is this, what will be set up for this entire year of Mark, of which, by the way, we don't hear from Mark nearly as often as we hear from Matthew and Luke in their own years, because he's so short. But what we do get every time we get Mark is we get this idea of Jesus is coming, he's coming tomorrow, get ready, be ready, seriously, like tomorrow, like immediately. You will hear in almost every gospel this year the word immediately. Immediately Jesus was in the wilderness, and immediately Jesus came out of the water, and immediately Jesus went to Jerusalem, and immediately Jesus healed, right? Immediately is this idea of Mark, because of this sense of sort of Jesus coming back tomorrow. And I think that urgency is something we have lost in the church because we haven't been because we've been waiting long past immediately. We've been waiting long past Jesus coming back tomorrow. We've been waiting for 2,000 years since Mark wrote this down, right? We have been waiting forever, it seems. And so we've lost some of that immediacy. And I think one of the fresh things about Mark is that everything is this idea that it's coming back tomorrow, right? Jesus is coming back tomorrow. Get ready, get ready, get ready. And we lose some of that in the church. And I think when we lose some of that, we lose some of the purpose that we have and some of the drive that we have. Because Jesus might come back tomorrow. He might come back next year. He might come back in another millennium, right? Who knows? But we sort of lose the oomph for action in the sort of in-breaking reign of God. So that's a lot that I threw at you today between hymns and readings. So I want to take a moment for us all to take a deep breath and just see, are there last thoughts? Are there concerns, questions, wonderings, ponderings, explorations, etc.?
Okay. Weird question.
Yes.
4 Gospels. Why aren't there like 4 years? Why are they only condensed into 3?
Right.
Is it 'cause
So
Mark's so short?
no, it's not because Mark's so short. It's because John is weird. So there are so the 4 Gospels are broken up in the following way. There are 3 synoptic Gospels and John,
Right.
meaning that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of story.
Stories that are
Jesus does a lot of going here, teaching there, healing that, right? John is really a sayings gospel. John is in the Bible because in the late 1st or 2nd century, the church needed to combat Gnosticism, which was this idea that you could escape Earth, right? So creation was bad, you wanted to be somewhere else, and you could get there by thinking about it, right? Gnosticism is all about knowledge, right? It's all about thinking and knowing.
Right. Okay.
John, that's why John starts with this really thinky beginning, right? John doesn't talk about Jesus being born, and
Right.
he doesn't even get started with the wilderness. What he starts with is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And by the way, word is sort of spoken thought,
Right.
right? Logos is this idea of thought, word, speaking, whatever. And so John doesn't get to have his own year. He's peppered throughout the other 3 to sort of balance out. So for example, I maybe I preached on this last year. Christmas Eve, we get Luke, human Jesus born in a crib. Christmas Day is always, in the beginning was the Word, because John serves to balance out Luke. If we read Luke, Jesus seems really human, right? He is born from a woman in a stable among the poor. That's a really human thing to do.
Mhm.
So we got to throw some John in there to remember that he's God.
Gotcha.
In the same way that while we have the passion story, so the story of the triumphal entry through to the crucifixion and resurrection, appears in all four Gospels, Holy Week, specifically the Triduum, so that's Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and the Easter Vigil, exclusively every year use John, because we want to lift up this idea of the dying God, right? We want to lift up what's in that particular passion narrative, even though, curiously enough, the church celebrates Maundy Thursday as the institution of the Lord's Supper, and John doesn't actually have the Lord's Supper. That's a whole nother story for another time. See me in the middle of August when we're on the month of bread. I will be talking a lot about John and communion. But so John doesn't get his own year just because he's weird.
Gotcha. Thank you.
But as I said, in the year of Mark, we get a lot of John because it does balance out. So for example, there'll be 6 weeks at the end of summer that are all about bread. It is the month of bread, because we basically sit and bathe in John 6, which is all about I am the bread of life, for like a bajillion verses.
Look forward to.
Basically every week for 6 weeks, Jesus says, I am the bread of life, which is really fantastic for preachers to have to preach on I am the bread of life for 6 weeks in a row. But yeah, so that's why that works out.
Thank you.
Are there other thoughts, concerns, questions, ponderings? If not, and trying to be respectful of time, next week we will do some Bible study and I will get the text to you for that. But next week's session, where we did hymns this week, next week's session we'll be talking about some of the other festivities of the season. So if you hadn't known before, yesterday, the 6th of December, was St. Nicholas Day, where we get some of our Christmas traditions from. Next Sunday, the 13th of December, is, and so that's good for you from the more Germanic areas of the world, of Europe. Next Sunday, the 13th of December, is Santa Lucia Day, for those of you from the more Scandinavian areas of the Lutheran Church. And then on the 20th, we actually celebrate Katharina von Bora, who is from the Luther household, right? So that's Luther's wife. Luther and sort of Lutheranism being one of the inspirations for some of the other Christmas traditions, like trees and lights and Advent wreaths and those sorts of things. So we'll talk a little bit about how we sort of take these Christmas feasts that are actual feast days and sort of spread them into some of our other traditions of the season. I hear somebody unmuted themselves, so is there a question? Yes, John.
I did. Who was it you mentioned for the 20th? I didn't catch that.
Katharina von Bora. So that's Luther's wife.
I'm not familiar with that, I don't think.
Well, I mean, so arguably nobody but the Lutherans celebrate her day, but her day on the church calendar is December 20th, which I always think is just a nice balance, because the 6th and the 13th and the 20th all fall exactly a week apart. And they all are people whose, either the celebration of whom or whose own lives contribute to our celebrations in the month of December. And so I always like this. I personally like to throw Katharina in there. But yeah, so Katharina von Bora Luther, that is Mrs. Martin Luther.
Mrs. Martin Luther. Oh.
Yes, Mrs. Martin Luther is Katharina von Bora Luther. I just figure if she's going to use all her names, we'll just leave her for who she is. So.
Interesting. Yep. Okay, thanks.
All right, folks. Thank you all for sharing with me and sticking with me through all this. And I will